Awesome. This is so exciting. Fantastic. First and foremost, can I thank you all for being here? It's lovely to know that people are interested in what I'm doing in terms of podcasting. So thanks very much. And I'm excited to hear all your questions at the end. Also, a big thank you to YWCA Scotland, the Young Women's Movement, for asking me to do this today. It's my first webinar, so here goes. But yeah, let me give you some information on what this webinar is all about. So I started a podcast last year called The Braw and the Brave, and I absolutely love it. It was one of the best decisions that I've ever made. And I'm no guru. This is very much just something that I do, and I'm still learning all the time. You know, I like to say every day is a school day. But over the last year and 8 months that I've been doing the podcast, I have been able to pick up so much information, develop new skills, as well as kind of honing ones that I already had. And I do it in a way that works for me. So the podcast is basically about people and their passions. And it is a passion project for me. It's a hobby that I do alongside my life and my work, and we'll get into all that. I guess it's quite interesting for anybody that's considering starting a podcast, because I do it alongside my job. It doesn't make me any money, but it is very much a hobby that I enjoy doing, and it was something I was totally new to. And yeah, hopefully I'll be able to give you some hints and tips of how you could get started. And there is no right way of doing it, as you'll probably know. There are lots of different types of podcasts and lots of different formats and how people do them, and do them very professionally. And also people like myself that do it as a hobby. So this webinar is more of an insight in how I do it personally, and how I create the podcast, how I get guests, the kind of research and prep that I do, and then the kind of post-production stuff that I do, and where I put it on the internet, all the good stuff. So what I should probably say is that I'm going to split this into sections. Hopefully that'll be useful, helpful. I have taught myself how to do this, and I've mostly used online as a tool. So I think when I was starting this podcast, it would have been really useful to have a webinar like this, just to hear somebody's experience and get 1, 2, or maybe 10 tips on how to do it. So this is what I'll try and cover in the time that we've got. Why I started a podcast, what my podcast is about, and what are my aims in creating it, who I invite to be a guest on the podcast, and who am I when I'm delivering my podcast. Who is my podcast persona? Who's listening? Who's listening to the podcast? Where I host it online, and where I promote it. When I podcast, and when I upload, and where I promote it as well. And I guess maybe the biggest burning question is, how do I do it? Technically, how do you do a podcast? And then there'll be room for questions at the end. Cool. So we've got the why, what, who, where, when, how. 6 things. And I'm doing them in that particular order, because I think that is the best order to describe how I do my podcast. So let's get on to the why. Why did I start a podcast? Why did I start a podcast? So to give you a bit of background, my name is Lisa Kennedy. I am a dancer, dance artist, and choreographer. I have worked in the arts for a long, long time. I've danced for a long, long time, even longer, since I was a kid, and started teaching and choreographing and performing professionally when I was about 19. And I'm now not 19. I'm now nearly 38. So I've been in the arts a long, long time. And as a creative person, I think I'm always just seeking those opportunities to be creative, but also stay connected. And the joy of my work is that I get to collaborate with lots of different people, not just dancers or choreographers, but also directors and lighting designers and set designers and builders, as well as other drama and dance and music practitioners, and also people in education, because I work in schools quite a lot. So over the course of my career, I've had lots of great opportunities to talk to and collaborate with dead interesting people that do amazing things, and I'm always itching to ask them questions. I like asking questions, and I love answering questions too. So, but also to give you another bit of knowledge, is that I did an English degree in a past life as well, before the dance really took over and became my profession. So I've always enjoyed reading and writing, and I've dabbled in writing blogs and stuff. So actually, the Braw and the Brave started life as a blog. I think it was in 2017, and I was working on a variety of projects, and I just had this idea of asking people that I knew to come and meet me, and we would talk about their passion, whether that be drama or dance or music, and it was predominantly people in the arts, because these were people that I was working with, collaborating with, or people that I knew, people that I was related to, friends and family. So yeah, my first episode of the blog, well, say episode, my first blog post rather, was with my good friend Deborah MacArthur, who's a theatre maker. I met her in a cafe. I bought a wee dictaphone, and I had a list of questions and bullet points, because of, you know, Deborah was is a friend, but I'd also worked with her. But there's lots of things that I didn't know about her career and about her passion for theatre, and where that had started way back before it became her job. So yeah, we sat down in that cafe. You know, I recorded the conversation. We had a lovely time, and then I got home, listened back, took notes, and then wrote it basically as a kind of magazine article, and kind of peppered it with quotes from Deborah, and then put it out as a blog. I think it was on Blogspot or something, one of these kind of free blog pages. And yeah, as much as I really enjoy writing, it's a really mindful task for me, and I do love it. And I'm writing a blog alongside the Braw and the Brave podcast. The best bit was the chat. It really was, like listening back to that dictaphone conversation, you know, just hearing the excitement in somebody's voice when they're talking about something that they totally love. It's really difficult for me as a writer. I'm sure there are people that are much more skilled in being able to do it, but it was really difficult to capture the essence of that conversation and the excitement, you know, and just the moments where we were having interaction. You know, she was telling a funny story, and then I was able to recount something like an anecdote from my life, and it was just that back and forth that we had was difficult to put into a blog post that really resembled what the conversation had been. And you know, I look back at those blog posts and I'm like, they're great, they're lovely, but they're not the same as that conversation. So alongside writing the blog and doing my job, I was listening to tons of podcasts while I was commuting, because as a freelancer in the arts, you're here, there and everywhere, and you've got a lot of times driving usually. So for me, or commuting. So yes, I was listening to a ton of podcasts, and it was actually my mum that said, why don't you start a podcast? Because I'd really let the blog slip. I'd really stopped doing the blog. It was just so time consuming, and I was agonising over every single word and every single sentence. So it just made absolute sense to translate the blog rather into a podcast. And that's what I decided to do kind of late 2018, started to put the wheels in motion. So yeah, it just was an opportunity to take that premise of asking someone to come on as a guest and talk about their passion. And essentially, I am fascinated by folk that do what they love and love what they do. And the art of sharing stories and good conversation is something that I really value, because I think it has the power to inspire and move and motivate people. So the blog and subsequently the podcast are a labour of love. It is a passion project, it is a hobby, but I have learned so much from doing both of them. You know, obviously the act of doing a podcast, I've learned a lot from that, but just the conversations with all these really interesting people. And actually, something that I didn't expect, and a lot of guests don't, but they say quite often after we've done the podcast episode, that they find it quite cathartic to stop and take stock of what has happened and everything that's going into their passion, whether that be a job or a hobby, and I will get on to that. But essentially, it's just a lovely thing to do. It's just really nice to sit down and be in the moment with somebody and be present, and ask them tons of questions and have a conversation and relate to them and be able to say, oh yeah, I feel like that too. And that, again, that's another thing that came out of doing the podcast. People that have listened have often messaged me, or even messaged the guest on social media and different things, to say that it's nice to hear someone's story and be able to relate, or even feel kind of comforted by some of their experiences, things like imposter syndrome and the self-employed hustle and things like that. A lot of people have been able to relate to the stories that these great people that have came on my podcast have told. So yeah, so the podcast isn't all about careers, and it isn't all about the creative industries. It's essentially about people and their passions. So to sum up why I do it, well, why I do it is that I love it, but why I started it was that, you know, I am passionate about dance, and I know there are people out there that are passionate about all manner of things, and things that are totally alien to me as well, and things that I'm very familiar with. It was a chance to be creative and make something that wasn't constrained by things like budget, deadlines, remits. You know, like when I'm choreographing a show, I'm working to a brief, I'm working to a timeline, I'm working to a budget, I'm working to someone else's vision, like the director, and trying to bring that to life. So the podcast was a chance for me to be totally creative on my own terms, and still have that collaboration though, not doing something on my own. And of course there are podcasts where people sit in a room and do it on their own, but for me it's very much that conversation, it's that interaction. I just like talking to people and listening to them. I like celebrating people's wins and people's passions, but also just that vulnerability that we have, and shared experiences feel important, and feel that you can learn a lot from what other people tell you that they've lived through. So yeah, it's to inspire people as well, inspire myself. And I think everything that goes into the podcast then goes back into my work, because the stories that I hear inspire new ideas and thoughts and different ways of working. So that is why I started a podcast. Wowzers. And I think it's just when I'm constantly thinking about the podcast, or, you know, starting a new episode or editing, that's just in the background of my mind. Why are you doing this? And when it maybe gets a bit overwhelming, or I'm not sure whether, you know, a certain guest is like, if I'm going to approach them or not, it's just, I constantly go back to that. Why are you doing this? And that helps to push me forward, I guess. Yeah. Okay, we're going to jump on to what is the Braw and the Brave. So the Braw and the Brave is about people and their passions. I've said that a few times, and that tagline has really helped me to, again, revert back all the time to be like, what is this about? Yeah, so even when I'm preparing for an interview or in the middle of an interview, I've just got that back in the back of my head, that this is about this person and their passions. Yeah, or their passion. There are lots of different types of podcasts, as you'll well know, I'm sure. There are very niche specific types of podcasts that discuss very specific things, and then there are ones that I would say have like a hook, where it leaves the door wide open for a variety of topics and subjects to be discussed, and possibly guests to come on. And that really is, for me, is what the Braw and the Brave is. Coming from an arts background, if I had limited it just to the arts, and that would have been fine, there are no rules, but if I just limited it to the arts and the creative industries, or, you know, the performing arts, then if I think about that now, and I think about some of the conversations that I've had in the podcast that haven't been with people from those industries, from that world, I'm like, oh, I can't imagine that, because I've spoken to so many different people, and I feel like each individual person that I spoke to have absolutely shaped what my podcast is. So, you know, for the likes of, like, for example, I spoke to a lovely man called Bruce Smart, aka Teapot One, who had a totally separate career, but I had a passion for motorbikes, and decided to go around the world on his motorbike as a tribute to his mum. Now, I had been watching his YouTube videos with my husband, and he just seemed really passionate, and he was a great storyteller. Now, he doesn't come from the creative arts kind of sector, so if I had made my podcast just about the arts, then he wouldn't have ticked that box, and then it maybe wouldn't have been the right fit for the podcast. So for me, it's been about just keeping it open enough to people and their passions, and, you know, and that can just then be anybody from anywhere who has a passion. And I know the podcast is called The Braw and the Brave, and some people have asked me, is it just Scottish people? No, there have been people, it's been predominantly Scottish people, but there have been people from, well, I spoke to someone recently who is Canadian. They did have a link to Scotland, but they weren't Scottish. So yeah, for me, it's just about keeping it open. And I think that has also helped the longevity of the podcast, because then it means that I've got more and more guests to be able to ask to come on the podcast. The tagline definitely helps. So I think it's good to being able to sum up your podcast to other people as well. So when I'm asking guests to come on, that I can sum it up pretty quickly, that I can say, right, I do a podcast. Oh, what's it about? It's about people and their passions. Boom, done. It's like your Dragon's Den pitch. And then I can go into more detail about my love for being fascinated by people who do what they love and love what they do, and the art of conversation and sharing stories is really important, something that I value. And I've got my little blurb that I would send out to people if I was asking them to go on the podcast. But I think just for me, it's good to have it in the back of my head, like, what is this? What it is? I have a section in the podcast as well called the Thingamabobs, which is a kind of constant thing at the end, where it's a series of fun, thought-provoking questions that I select from a list that I've got for each guest, and that just always kind of helps to bring up some interesting, funny anecdotes. And it's just, I'm asking them just to kind of answer them in the moment, so they don't get them in advance. So things like, finish this sentence, I have always wanted to. Where do you not mind waiting? Best advice ever given to me. And then there's some like really random or very specific ones, and I usually just pick out a few for each guest. And I'll always have a constant one, which is the last thing I ask is, what is your favourite Scottish word or phrase? And that always brings up some fun stories or hilarity, or we share like the ones that we enjoy or ones that we've heard that we didn't know. So that's kind of what my podcast is. It is an interview with someone who is passionate about a particular subject, whether it be their job or whether it be a hobby. And yes, it very much is an interview scenario, but I want it to be conversational. So I make sure that I am very present in the moment. I've got a list of questions or bullet points in front of me, but I am not glued to that. I am very much just responding in the moment. So quite often you'll get a wee story for me, something that relates to what that person has said. You know, if we have had a similar situation, or we've worked together, say, or we know somebody, then in the moment, if it feels right to say it, I'm going to say it. I'm not completely silent, nodding my head the entire time. Although I have got better at doing that kind of interview, telly, radio type stuff when doing the remote podcasting. On that note, so obviously my podcast includes guests, but I know podcasts out there don't always include guests. It's just maybe a host or two hosts. But the fact that I do have guests means that there is obviously prep and stuff that goes into before, you know, the interview itself. And the format is that back and forth, as I say. But I keep that premise the same. It usually is me and another guest, or two guests. 3 at the most, I think I've had. That's not a limit I've put on it. That is just there has been 3 maximum. I think, oh no, that's a lie. That's a lie. I've interviewed a band before, so there was more, which was great. So yeah, so it's me and guests type thing. That is what the podcast is. Remote podcasting is different because prior to lockdown, I'd done all my podcasts, so that was 70 episodes. I'd done them face to face in real life. I hadn't done any of them on the internet. That was something I just hadn't considered. Well, I had considered it and thought, that's not for me. Because a few guests had actually asked if we could do it remotely, and at the time I was just like, no, I want to meet you, I want to see you. I did this podcast to be connected and to be in the moment, and it is different virtually. It just is. It's lovely, but it's different. So I'd very much been like, no, that's not for me. But of course, we all know what happened in March when lockdown happened. It was like, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to continue the podcast online and figure it out how to do it remotely, or are you going to just pause? And I had a bank of episodes that I'd recorded, so I had a few that I could still put out because I'm putting them out weekly, and we'll get on to that. But it was just like, right, well, you've got a decision here. So I decided to figure it out like I had done with actually doing a podcast. So I have been remote podcasting since March, and I am now up to, well, I've released in total 103. So that's over 30 episodes that I've recorded in lockdown. That's a lot. And I have been putting out 2 a week instead of 1 a week, just because I have been recording as much and working in the arts. I'm not busy at the moment. So that has been lovely to keep the podcast going and to keep creative on lockdown. Yeah, it's been actually a total lifeline. So, what is my podcast? It's about people and their passion. It's an interview kind of vibe style of podcast. It is about the person, and each podcast episode is named with that person's name or that company's name or band or whoever it may be. And I think it's important, and these are a couple of things actually I've got on my list here that I probably didn't fully consider until I had to. So my podcast is very conversational. It's got a positive vibe, I would say, but things have came up on the podcast that need to be addressed, like explicit content. So the first time someone swore on my podcast, it was like, oh, am I allowed to swear? And I was like, we're in the moment. I don't want to stop anybody from being who they are. It doesn't make you a bad person. But then I had to look into, are you allowed to swear on a podcast? And do you have to then tell people that there are sweary words on this podcast? So anyway, that was something I had to look into. And each hosting site, wherever you put your podcast on the internet, will have its own terms and conditions. And I am not going to get into that because I am not a guru, as I said. But I looked into it, and the hosting site that I use, you have to be explicit in that there is explicit content that includes a swear word or adult themes or all that kind of jazz. So my podcast now has one of those wee E's next to it, but really in a whole 103 episodes there are hardly any swear words in there, but it's one of these things that you have to be honest about, and I'm sure different host sites will have their own rules and regulations that you have to look into. Of course, I could have edited that out, and I have in the past edited them out because someone's asked me to, or that I've just so happened to have edited that section out. So these are things that you just got to think about in advance. And if you don't want someone to swear in your podcast, then it's probably a good idea to tell them beforehand. Also, things like triggering themes, so things that are sensitive that people might get upset hearing about, then that came up for me later in my podcasting journey, more recently I would say. And what I have done is just put like a kind of little voiceover part at the start of the episode to say that we discuss certain themes, and also that there are links, helpful links, support links in the show notes. And I tend to put a couple of links to different charities or like NHS's website, whatever it's relating to. And I write it in the show notes as well. And any social media posts, if I feel like I should flag it up, I just do. And that's just me being a responsible podcast host, I feel. So these are things that, I didn't necessarily think about initially because I didn't have to until the situation arose, and then I was like, oh right, I better figure this out. And the internet's a wonderful thing, as we all know, and I was able to find that information quite easily. But also there are lots of people out there podcasting, and if you follow podcasts, then reach out to someone and ask them. There's been so many people that I've got to know through this podcast who also do podcasts. So send them a message and just ask them the question. I'm sure somebody will tell you the answer or their take on it, at least their experience. And lastly, in terms of what is your podcast, what does it look like? What's the format of it? What kind of style of podcast? What's it about? If you're going to promote it anywhere, then you might want to have a logo and things like that. So it's like, what's the look of my podcast, and what's it going to look like on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or SoundCloud or wherever you're putting it. So you might want to consider having a photograph or a logo. And I haven't had anything made professionally. I have just mocked something up myself that works for me. So that is what is your podcast. So my podcast is The Braw and the Brave. It's about people and their passions. It's an interview style, kind of conversational, really relaxed, informal type interview scenario with some fun questions at the end that are a bit random, and I have a new guest or guests on each episode. That is what my podcast is, and it's a good question to ask yourself before you start one. Oh, I hope we're all doing fine. I feel like I'm talking to myself. This is really weird. Let's move on to who. So here's the question. Who's talking and who's listening? That's really what you should think about if you're thinking about doing a podcast. In terms of who's talking, that's not something that I thought about, apart from obviously the guest side things, but as me as a host, it wasn't something that I overly thought about prior to doing it. And that comes from my arts background. Because I am a dance artist and a performer, I have had a lot of opportunity to stand up in front of people and talk. Yes. And I've honed that skill over the many years that I've been doing it. I remember when I started, well, I've been dancing for a long time, and then saying to my parents, I want to teach dance. And they were like, yeah, well, we know you can dance, but can you actually teach it? And it is a skill within itself to be able to communicate yourself well to lots of different people. And that's essentially what you're doing on the podcast. But if you're going to have guests on your podcast, then it's about communicating with them in the moment, regardless of who's going to listen to it. So I didn't overthink about who I was going to be on the podcast. I just wanted to be myself. But like in any scenario in our lives, we have different versions of ourselves in different scenarios. Whether you're at work or whether you're with your mates or whether you're with your family, you're essentially you, but you're a version of yourself. And that's really what I am on the podcast. I think in the moment, I want to make the person feel really comfortable, that I'm being myself. I'm not putting on a radio stage kind of performance of any kind of sort, but that I'm professional and that I'm in control. I want them to feel that they are at ease in my presence as we sit across from each other with a mic in the middle of us. Because it's worthwhile considering that if you're going to have guests on your podcast, that they might be a bit nervous because they're not in the driver's seat. It's you that's doing the thing. So it does help if you look like you know what you're doing and that you're able to kind of settle any of their nerves or answer any questions that they might have. But in terms of being heard by other people, for me, it was just really important that I am clear, and hopefully I am for you today. But that I'm not putting on an accent or a staged voice. I do speak really fast, and I think I'm speaking quite fast today, but that's because I want to. It's because I want to get through it all. But that I am being clear and understood by my guest first and foremost, obviously. So it's about just thinking about in advance, possibly if you're not used to being recorded or not used to addressing people in your everyday life, that how do you want to come across on your podcast? And I guess if you're sharing a lot of information, if your podcast is going to be one where you are offering up research or things that your opinion, then it's just the language that you use and your style of basically conversing. So I'm very much me, if anyone knows me on this is me. This is what I'm like. And also, when I was saying the question, who's talking and who's listening, who's talking also refers to your guests. So when I started the podcast as a blog, obviously I was considering people that I knew that would be comfortable sitting down with me and chatting. Yes, they were going to be recorded, but that recording wasn't going to be used for public consumption. Now it's different because it's a podcast. So it's important to think about if you're going to get guests on, why are you getting them on? You've got to think back to that tagline, what is my podcast about? And that that they're going to be comfortable in sharing their experience, whatever that may be, for X amount of time on your podcast. My podcast probably lasts about an hour. Most episodes are about an hour. So it's worthwhile considering, like, who am I getting on my podcast? Are they the right fit? Are they going to be comfortable in talking about themselves or the experiences? And that's just been something that I've gone with my gut on, really. It started like that with the blog. It was just very much like people I knew and people that I'd worked with and people that I knew were comfortable to be in my company and have a blether, have a chat. As the podcast has progressed, I have now branched into asking people that I don't know which is dead exciting. It's lovely. And people have actually asked to come on the podcast, which is amazing. And again, I've just went with my instinct and my gut on that. I do a lot of research. I use social media a lot. I go onto people's websites. I ask people their opinions. I've also had recommendations from former podcast guests, which are really helpful because they obviously know the process and they know what goes into it. So that's dead helpful for them to kind of give their recommendations for who they think would be good. And yeah, if I like what somebody's doing and I think they're putting out positive vibes, I'll reach out and we'll start a conversation. I guess it's important to say that everybody that I have contacted to ask them to possibly come on the podcast and give them a wee bit of a initial insight into what it's about. You know, I don't fire them with Hunter's information to start with because I don't think that's useful. I just give them the blurb that I was talking about. Yeah, not everyone has replied and not everyone has said yes, and that's fine. And I say that in my blurb. I'm sure you're inundated with similar unpaid requests because it's a hobby. I can't pay anybody to come on this podcast. But if you would like to consider it, then maybe have a listen to the podcast, get an idea of what it's about. And I also put in it just that, if it's not for you, or if it's just not right now, you've not got the time or you've not got the inclination, that's fine. And I say that in my blurb just because I don't want anybody to feel pressured, especially if it's people that I know. I don't want them to feel like, oh, right, well, I know Lisa, so I better. No, I want it to be a pleasurable experience. So I only want you to come on if you want to come on and do the podcast. So that's important just if you're considering starting a podcast and having guests. Are they the right fit for your podcast? Are they going to be able to chat away freely and offer up any information or, their experience on your podcast? And that's really in terms of guests. But again, like I say, some podcasts don't have guests, so that might be not something you need to think about. And lastly, who's listening? Now this was a secondary thought. And that's not to say that my listeners are not important, because they really are. But I didn't start this podcast for other people. I started it for me because it's a passion project and it's a hobby. It's lovely and it amazes me every time when someone says, oh, I listened to episodes, and I'm like, what? You listen to my podcast? That's mental. But it wasn't about like how many listeners I'll get or who's going to listen. And all matter of people from around the world listen to the Braw and the Brave, which blows my tiny mind as well. I didn't get caught up in that because it wasn't about the who's going to consume this. It was the act of doing it, something that I enjoy. The act of doing the interview, the research beforehand, the interview itself, and then the post-production stuff like editing. I'd never done that before. I really enjoy it. It's time consuming the way I do it, but I like it. And then doing the kind of social media attached to it, because I've got social media pages that are linked to the podcast. I enjoy that whole process. But the best bit's the conversation. It really is. The best bit, that for me is the best bit. So it's lovely that people listen to it. And it might be a concern for you, and I'm not judging anybody who's thinking about the listeners, but I'm just saying that it wasn't something that I overly thought about it when I was starting the podcast. It was just very much like, I would like to do a podcast and maybe people will listen to it. That would be nice. And maybe they would get something from it. That would be amazing. Or maybe that would form a connection between two people that would be helpful for work or support, or amazing. But none of these things that I could predict. Certainly as the podcast has grown, then, and my followers on social media and the podcast itself, and there is a way to see stats on the host site that I use, so I know how many people are accessing the podcast. And people leave reviews and things like that on Apple Podcasts and send you nice messages. But engaging with listeners has been lovely too, which was totally unexpected, because I didn't know if it was just going to be my mum that listened to it. So yeah, I do my very best to reply to everybody that sends me a message. Anyone who shares anything on social media to do with the podcast, I'm like, thanks so much. Because also for my guests, if they're doing amazing things, they're creating like amazing music, or like YWCA are doing amazing work, I want people to know about that. I'm like, I didn't know about YWCA. Oh my goodness, where have I been? And when Patricia and Ange from YWCA, the Young Women's Movement, came on to the podcast, it was like a revelation. I'm like, this is amazing. Why? Like, I wish this existed when I was a young person, and all the work that they were doing. So I wanted more people to know about that, because I'm a sharer of information. Like, if I see something that I think will be useful or helpful to somebody in real life, I'll just send you it. Yeah, and I do that anyway. So through the podcast, it's like a means to tell people good stuff, great news, think good things that are happening. You'd maybe like that, check it out. So that has been lovely that the podcast can do that. You know, it can put people into other people's music or their dance work, or someone who's creating amazing prints, or someone who went around the world on their motorbike or tried to cycle the world. I've had someone on the podcast that was cycling around the world. These are all amazing stories that should be heard, because humans are amazing and they do really cool things and they do really great things. And it was, I feel really privileged to hold that space for people and allow them to tell me their stories. So yeah, in terms of like it's who you are on your podcast, who's talking to you, or is it just you that's talking? Is it you and another host, and what is your relationship with each other? Who does what? Yeah, I mean, in terms of who does what, I do all. It's me, myself, and I do everything. And then who's listening? Who's listening to your podcast? It's worthwhile having a think about that. Yeah, that is who. Oh my goodness! Look at the time, 22. Are people still here? Oh, thanks, guys. I appreciate you still being here. So, let me jump very quickly onto where and when. Yeah, where and when. Where I do the podcast prior to, oh, thanks, Lauren, give me a thumbs up there, Belter. Prior to lockdown, that's a sentence I have to say a lot. Predominantly, I was recording the podcast at home on my kitchen table and inviting guests to come to my house. Or if that didn't suit them, then I would go to their house or their place of work. So it was a face-to-face scenario. When it's in your environment, it's easier to control that, of course. So when people are coming to my house, I've got the mic and laptop and everything set up, and I can give them the lowdown of like, don't tap the table because the mic then distorts and things like that. But when you're having to go out on location to do a podcast, then there's things that you can try and control in advance or on the day, but it's a wee bit more difficult. So I would say a quiet, small, comfortable space is good wherever you are, whether you're doing it even remotely. In terms of the sound quality, if it's a smaller space, that helps. If it's not a big echoey room, I've been in an echoey room and done a podcast. We just went with it. If it's a quiet space, that's really helpful. I have done a podcast recording in a restaurant, which was fine. We were very close at the time. It was before we had to be like 2 meters apart. But there was background noise, which obviously the microphone picked up, and then there was situational music, which didn't actually even realise at the time that there was music in the background. Hadn't even clocked it. We weren't really supposed to be recording in a restaurant, but it was a change of location. And it was in the edit where I was like, oh no, I can hear music. So I had to look into that. It turns out it was okay because it was situational music and it wasn't very clear what the music was, to be honest with you. But to avoid that, you're better to be in a small, quiet space. There's probably going to be interruptions at times, unless you're in a podcasting studio, which I can talk about as well. But I have done all my podcasts either obviously remotely, which has happened on lockdown, but at home in my kitchen or at someone else's abode. And yeah, postman chaps the door, or somebody's baby wakes up, and these are all things you can deal with post-production if you're going to edit your podcast. Yeah, that makes obviously it more necessary to edit unless you're happy for those interruptions to be part of your podcast. So if you can minimize all that stuff like distractions and things, then it helps. Where I do it in terms of where I put it on the internet, and we'll get to that on the how bit, how I make the podcast happen. I guess you've got to decide like where is it going to live once you've got this episode, this file ready to go somewhere. Then it's about choosing, is it going to go on a website? Is it your own website? Is it going to go on Apple Podcasts? Is it going to go on Spotify? Is it going to go on SoundCloud? Is it going to go on Spreaker? And these are things that you just need to research yourself and decide what is right for you. sorry, I can't tell you what to do, because as I say, I'm not a guru, I'm not an expert in podcasting, I just do what I do and what works for me. And it is a learning process as well. I've totally learned stuff that I'll take forward with me in my podcasting journey. So in terms of where, it's probably useful to say about the remote podcasting scenario. Where I do it is at home when I'm remote podcasting, and the person is usually at their home, and there'll be things like being in a quiet, small, comfortable space that help when you're doing it remotely, because again, we're just capturing audio. So if the audio can be, you know, a nice, neat sound without any background noise, that is helpful. And where do I promote it? I promote it on 3 social media pages, predominantly Instagram, Facebook and Twitter, that are linked to the Braw and the Brave. That is where. And when I record is when I've got time. When I've got time to do it, and when the guest is available, whether that be remotely or whether it be face-to-face. And obviously face-to-face does limit you in terms of who can do the podcast, because if they live abroad, then if you want to do it face-to-face, you're going to have to do a wee visit, or they're going to have to come to you. That would be nice, mind you. I'd quite like a wee visit to somewhere abroad right now. But even remotely, you know, there needs to be you need to have the time to do it. And like I was saying earlier on, most of my podcasts last about an hour, but the recording, the whole scenario can take up to 2 hours. You know, there's a bit of chat beforehand, making everybody feel at ease, and then a bit of a chat afterwards, because I'm a chatty Cathy, as you can tell. So yeah, so when I do it is when I've got time, and when my guests have got time to do it, and we just organise that through email or social media kind of DMs. When I can record more episodes, I do that so that I bank them, like I was saying earlier on, and it means that I don't need to necessarily record every week. So when I'm really busy with work, remember those days? There was times where I didn't record for weeks, but I had recorded maybe 6 or 7 in 1 week, because it was a school holiday and I had loads of time off school. So I just grabbed as many people and recorded. So yeah, I just do it when I can. In terms of when I release the podcast, I started releasing once a week on a Wednesday, I think it was initially. Yeah. Or Thursday. I think I changed the days, but it was one episode a week, and I have not stopped. So I've not had a break. There's not been a week since I started where I haven't put an episode. That's not, you know, I'm not saying that's the right way to do it. There's plenty of podcasts, series that do maybe like a season of like 4 or 5 and then stop, and then they probably record like a bank and then do another season 2. I just wanted this podcast to be part of my life. I wanted to make room in my life for a hobby. So I have, and like everything I do, I go all in. So we haven't stopped. And actually on lockdown, I was recording so much because I wasn't working, because I work in the arts, that I actually started putting out 2 a week. So one goes out on a Wednesday and another one goes out on a Saturday. Now that might change, because, you know, when I do go back to working, that'll be lovely. I won't have as much time, and it is time consuming. So there's no rules. There are no rules whatsoever. That just is what I do. And I know I keep saying that, but this is how I do it. I'm just telling you what I do. So let's go on to how. I'm all right for time. Right, how I actually do it. I guess the first thing is the research that goes into the guest, and, you know, picking the right guest. And once that's happened, you know, I've got enough information to ask the person in the first place, but then after that, I make sure that I do a bit of research, just to make sure that when I'm writing my notes and things that I want to know, and questions and, you know, topics and different things that we'll go through, that I have a bit of background knowledge. But for me, that isn't, like, I don't do tons of research in terms of, like, I'm not going to sit and then spout their CV back to them. It's not important what I know, it's how I can ask them the question. Well, basically, how I can ask them good questions to get the right answers that I want. I didn't put that in a very good way. So the questions that I have are pretty generic, actually, and I just alter them for each guest. Writing them down for me is just a process that I do beforehand, and they kind of stick. It's not something I'm constantly referring to during the conversation, because I want to be in the moment. I don't want to feel the person feels that that I'm not present, that I'm, they're giving an answer and I'm going, oh, right. No, that's not how I want it to be. So I will literally listen to the person when I've asked them a question, and then I will just respond accordingly. Like if they say, oh, in 2007 I moved to Canada. Oh wow, right. Why did you move to Canada? Blah blah blah. All right. Oh, so that's where yeah. So it's just a natural conversation. I don't get hung up on knowing every single itty bitty bit of information. But if there's things that have intrigued me, I've been looking them up and being like, oh, I wonder why they did that, or oh, that's cool. Oh, tell me about this. Oh, I saw on your page that blah blah blah. So it's just kind of conversation starter. So how I do it is I research the person to a point. I've got notes or bullet points on to hand, so I can see them if I feel like I just need to have a wee glance, but it's not something I fixate on. And yeah, of course, prior to them going on the podcast, I will have contacted them with that elevator pitch, if you like, tell them what the podcast is about, a wee bit of information of how we could do it. We could do it face to face, or we could do it remotely. At the moment, it's all remotely. And just giving them as much information as they need at that point. Once they say yes, obviously, then we go into the itty bitty of how we're going to do it and when we're going to do it. If in a scenario where someone was coming to my house, let's give it that information. So I've got the laptop sitting, I've got my microphone, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. I've got everything set up, ready to rock. And when the person comes in, they can see that this is a setup. You'll sit there, I'll sit here. Don't tap the table because it distorts the mic. That's my favourite settings. Still happens though. And while we're having a blether, I'll say to them, listen, I'm going to do a wee test record. And I hit record and we're still blethering away. And then I stop recording and then I have a wee listen. And actually, I've continued that practice on remote podcasting because we've been in a scenario where the audio didn't record. And that's a good point. I will mention that in a minute. So once it's recorded, then it's the editing process. And how are you going to edit it? Are you going to put music at the beginning or the end? Are you going to quieten things down? Are you going to make things louder? Are you going to cut out that sweary word? Is it too long? Is it too short? Whatever it may be. So there'll be an editing part of it, post-production. And then you'll decide where you're going to put it on the internet. So I guess I should go into what equipment I use. So I've got a laptop. I've got a microphone, which I'm actually using just now. I'm going to lift it up, hopefully not distort it. This is the Blue Yeti podcast mic. You might have seen this if you've looked into any sort of podcasting microphones. My mum bought me it for my Christmas when she said, you should start a podcast. And I said, I think I will. So she kindly bought me it. The pop shield that's on it, that's this thing here, the black thing, doesn't come with that particular mic, but we bought it because if I'm doing any just voiceover stuff for the podcast where it's just me, it does help with any distortion. So I've got that on there. It's a USB mic, so there's a cable that comes with it, although I have got 2 backup cables because the cable broke. And it goes straight into the laptop. And the means to which, excuse me, I record the podcast is using a thing called Audacity, which is a software that you can download. It was free. And it has an editing tool. So you can record the actual audio from your microphone onto Audacity in the moment, and then you can edit it on there and create the MP3 file or WAV file that you're going to use to put out onto the internet. So it's been a great tool. That's the only thing I use is Audacity for recording when it's face to face. It's different for remote podcasting. I'll get to that. So there are obviously various other editing audio websites and softwares, and it's worthwhile looking into what one's right for you, but it's quite user friendly. I just learned how to use it by using it and just footing about with it. And there's just certain features on Audacity that I use and I stick to, and I don't worry about the rest. Once I'm happy with the edit, so we rewind for a second, just wait a time. Once we've recorded it, I save it. Don't forget to save it. Don't talk to your guest and forget to save it. Nearly been there. And then once you have edited it, then it's about deciding where it's going to go on the internet. And like I mentioned earlier on, there are various host sites. I pay for mine. SoundCloud, like I mentioned earlier on, I pay for a pro account. I think it was £90 for the year. I think this microphone was about the same price. And yeah, that gives me unlimited uploads of podcasts. there are pros to that host site and there are cons which I've learned, and that I might change my host site next year. But I've spoke to a few other podcasters ahead of doing this, and other people have suggested Anchor, which have a feature that you can use on your phone, and it's free, and it has certain editing tools on it and stuff. So if you were just want to try it out, Anchor might be a good one. Spreaker was another one that someone mentioned, and they said it was really, really good, and it puts it out to other streaming websites. So my podcast is on SoundCloud. That's where I upload every single individual episode, but then it is also linked to Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and that's through what's called an RSS feed, which your host site will generate. I am not an expert. These are things that I am literally saying because I've had to learn how to do it my way. Whatever host site you decide to host yours on will give you information that you need to put it elsewhere. And, you know, if you just look it up on the internet, the information will be there. I'd love to go into more detail, but I'm aware of time. And remote podcasting, I use a couple of different things. I use Zoom, not so much, but I do, because you have a facility to record it, as we know. Also have been using Zencaster, which has been free on lockdown, which is amazing. There's no visual parts, just audio, but it's great. Gives you 2 different audio files that you can then just put straight into Audacity or whatever software you're using to edit, just as you would normally edit. And I've used Squadcast, which I pay for, and it has some sort of kind of post-production stuff built in, which makes for nice audio. And the music that I used, I looked online and I paid for copyright free music that I know I can use on my podcast, because obviously you can't just be using music that belongs to somebody without their permission. Yes. Cool. And I've got a list of a couple of things of what to think about, but maybe this is a good place to stop talking and answer any questions. Wowzers, have I said everything I wanted to say? I feel like I've just went blah, blah, blah. I don't talk this much on my actual podcast, by the way. I really don't. So let's see, has anybody got any questions, or are you all just ready for a snooze?